The stars burned cold in the Andromeda sector, where Queen Valandra ruled for 3,000 years, and her empire stretched across 40 systems with absolute power over all who lived there. And she sat upon her throne aboard the living warship called Thornheart, with her dragon Ashenthar coiled beside her massive body, and the dragon was made of shadows and starfire, and his very presence could tear holes through space itself, and nothing in the known universe could match his terrible power. Valandra herself was both beautiful and terrifying, with silver hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that glowed with ancient magic accumulated over centuries. And she had witnessed civilizations rise from nothing and fall to dust. And she had ended wars with a single command and stopped rebellions with a mere thought, and nothing surprised her anymore. Or so she believed until the day a small human ship wandered into her forbidden territory by accident. The ship bore the name Pioneer, and it carried 60 human colonists who were simply looking for a new home among the stars, and they had made an error in their navigation systems and crossed into space that belonged to the Elvari Empire, and Valandra ordered her patrol ships to capture them within hours, and the humans did not fight back at all, and they seemed weak and confused and harmless. Kate Morrison commanded the Pioneer, and she was tall with short dark hair and steady eyes that showed no fear. And when the Elvari soldiers brought her before Queen Valandra, she did not bow or show submission, and she stood straight and looked directly into the ancient eyes of the queen, and this behavior annoyed Valandra greatly, but it also caught her attention because very few beings dared to meet her gaze. The Elvari studied their new prisoners with great curiosity because these humans were unlike any species they had encountered before, and the humans possessed no magic in their blood whatsoever, and they had no natural weapons or armor on their bodies, and their lifespans were terribly short, at barely 1 century if they were very lucky, and they seemed fragile and unremarkable in every way, and Valandra wondered why she should even bother studying such inferior creatures. But Queen Valandra was nothing if not thorough in all her endeavors, and she ordered her best interrogators to question the humans extensively and learn everything possible about their species and their worlds and their capabilities, and the interrogators worked in carefully organized shifts, and they kept the humans awake for many days without rest, and they asked endless questions about human culture and technology, and they used Elvari magic to drain the energy from human bodies, and this technique had worked perfectly on every single species the Elvari had ever encountered before, and after only 2 or 3 cycles, even the strongest warriors from other races would collapse in exhaustion. The humans did not collapse at all, and after 5 complete cycles, they appeared tired but remained alert and focused, and after 7 cycles, the Elvari guards themselves began falling asleep at their posts, while the human prisoners remained awake and aware. And after 10 full cycles of continuous questioning, Kate Morrison looked directly at Valandra and stated calmly that this treatment was nothing compared to what humans regularly endured in their normal lives. Valandra could not believe what she was hearing, and she rose from her throne and walked down the steps to face Kate directly, and the queen demanded to know how such a thing could be possible. And Kate explained patiently that humans were built for endurance above all else, and their bodies adapted to almost any condition, and sleep deprivation was merely uncomfortable for humans who had survived conditions far worse throughout their history. Ashenthar the dragon stirred from his rest for the first time in weeks, and he opened one massive glowing eye and studied the human prisoners with newfound interest. And something about these small, weak creatures troubled his ancient mind, and he had lived for 10,000 years and seen countless species rise and fall, and these humans reminded him of something from the distant past, and something very dangerous. Valandra made her decision quickly, as she always did, and she would release Kate Morrison, but attach a hidden tracking beacon to the human ship, and the humans would unknowingly lead her entire fleet back to their home systems. And then Valandra would launch a massive preemptive attack and eliminate this species before they could become any sort of problem for her empire. And she told Kate to leave immediately and spread word of Elvari power throughout human space. Kate understood the trap right away because she was far more than just a simple colony captain. And before joining the Pioneer, she had served in the Special Forces of Earth for 15 long years, and she knew military tactics and strategy better than most. And she took her crew and departed from Thornheart. But she did not fly toward home at all. And instead, she led the massive Elvari fleet on a very long chase through the most dangerous regions of space. For many months, Kate flew her ship through dense asteroid fields and radiation zones that would kill most creatures, and she pushed her little vessel to its absolute limits. And the Elvari fleet followed close behind, but they had to stop regularly for rest periods and repairs and maintenance, and the humans never stopped moving at all, and they worked in carefully rotating shifts, and when one crew member needed sleep, another would immediately take their place at the controls, and the ship kept moving day and night without any pause whatsoever. Queen Valandra grew more frustrated with each passing week because she sent her fastest ships, but Kate outmaneuvered them every time, and she sent even more ships. But Kate found clever ways to lose them in dead zones, where sensors could not function properly, and every single time Valandra believed she finally had the humans cornered, they would slip away through some impossible maneuver, and it was humiliating for a queen who had never tasted defeat. During all this time, Valandra became completely obsessed with understanding these strange humans, and she ordered her best scholars to find any available information about the planet Earth and its people, and what they discovered in the ancient databases shocked everyone. And human history was absolutely filled with examples of impossible endurance, and humans had fought wars lasting for years and years without ever stopping, and they had crossed entire continents on foot, carrying heavy loads, and they had survived in frozen wastelands where nothing else could live, and in burning deserts where water was almost non-existent. One particular report deeply disturbed Valandra when she read it carefully, and it described human medics who performed complex surgery for 20 continuous hours during a terrible war, and another report described soldiers who marched for days without any sleep to reach an important battle. And yet another described workers who built massive structures over the course of decades through constant daily labor, and humans did not merely endure hardship when necessary, but they actually turned endurance itself into a weapon against their enemies. The Elvari generals warned their queen repeatedly about what they were learning, and they explained that humans were survivors by their very nature, and every single human carried genes inherited from ancient ancestors who had hunted large prey animals to complete exhaustion. And humans were neither fast nor strong compared to other species, but they could outlast absolutely anything. And they never stopped moving forward, and they never gave up under any circumstances. Ashenthar spoke privately with Valandra in her chambers, and the ancient dragon told her about a species from long ago called the Enduring Ones, and they had appeared thousands of years in the past in a distant galaxy, and they possessed no special powers or abilities, but they had conquered everything through sheer unstoppable persistence, and it had required 3 allied empires working together just to contain them, and even then they were never truly defeated. And Ashenthar feared greatly that humans were the same type of species. Valandra dismissed this as mere myth and legend from ages past, and she absolutely refused to believe that such short-lived creatures could possibly threaten her eternal empire, and she committed even more ships and soldiers to the hunt, and she would catch Kate Morrison soon and crush the humans completely before they became dangerous. Finally, after 6 long months of pursuit, Kate led the entire Elvari fleet directly to the Titan Gate, and this was a massive human space station positioned at the very edge of human territory, and it was heavily armed with hundreds of weapons and fully staffed with thousands of personnel, and Kate had successfully bought enough precious time for all of humanity to prepare properly for the coming war. The Elvari armada arrived in overwhelming numbers that blocked out the stars, and Valandra had brought 300 warships, including her mighty Thornheart, and she fully expected the humans to surrender immediately when they witnessed such devastating power arrayed against them, but instead, the humans opened fire with everything they had. The battle began with a truly devastating exchange of weapons. Fire and Elvari ships possessed powerful energy weapons and magical shields that could deflect most attacks, and human ships fought back with railguns and massive missile batteries. And the Elvari expected to break through the human defenses very quickly, but the humans fought with such desperate intensity that it shocked everyone, and every ship that fell was immediately replaced by another, and human reinforcements kept arriving from deeper in their territory. What truly shocked the Elvari forces was that the battle never stopped for even a moment, and human crews worked in precisely timed 4-hour shifts, and when one team grew too tired to continue fighting, a completely fresh crew would take over their positions, and the humans ate their meals while still manning their battle stations, and they slept in their combat suits for brief periods and then returned immediately to fighting. And the Elvari had never encountered anything like this in all their centuries of warfare. The Elvari military culture had been built over thousands of years on concepts of honor and civilized rest periods, and traditional battles had very clear phases, where armies would fight intensely, and then both sides would withdraw to rest and recover, and then they would fight again the next day. And this was how warfare was supposed to be conducted among civilized species, but the humans completely ignored all such customs and traditions, and they fought around the clock without any pause whatsoever, and if an Elvari ship tried to pull back to rest, the human ships would immediately follow and continue attacking without mercy. Days turned into long weeks, and the siege of Titan Gate continued without stopping for even one moment, and Elvari crews began to break down mentally and physically from the constant exhaustion, and they simply were not built for this kind of endless grinding combat that never allowed recovery, and some ships had to withdraw completely from the battle because their crews were too tired to function at all. And meanwhile, the human forces kept rotating fresh personnel into the fight and maintained constant, unrelenting pressure on every front. On the 30th day of continuous battle, Queen Valandra stood on the command bridge of Thornheart and screamed in pure frustration at what she was witnessing, and she could not understand how humans could possibly sustain this incredible pace of warfare, and she broadcast a message across all channels demanding answers from Kate Morrison, and she wanted to know how they could fight 10 times in one night without stopping, and how this was even possible for such weak creatures. Kate Morrison sent back a reply that was heard across the entire battlefield by both sides, and she told Valandra very clearly that humans would gladly fight 100 times if that became necessary. And that was simply what humans did, and they did not know how to quit, and they did not understand the very concept of giving up. And when things became hard, humans simply worked harder. This response shook the Elvari forces to their core, and morale began to collapse rapidly among soldiers who had fought victoriously for many centuries, and they realized with growing horror that they were facing an enemy that literally could not be outlasted, and deep fear spread throughout the fleet like a disease, and some ships began to quietly desert rather than continue this absolute nightmare of endless combat. Ashenthar refused to fight anymore, and the ancient dragon told Valandra directly that he would not help destroy these humans, and he had seen enough to know what they truly were, and they were exactly what he had feared from the beginning, and they were the enduring ones reborn in this age, and if the Elvari continued this war, it would eventually consume the entire empire from within, and Valandra Valandra was absolutely furious, but even she could not force an ancient dragon to fight against his will. The war continued into its second month, and then its third, and what Valandra had carefully planned as a quick demonstration of overwhelming power had turned into an absolute nightmare. And human tactics were completely unlike anything the Elvari military had ever encountered in thousands of years of conquest. And instead of large, decisive battles with clear winners and losers, the humans waged constant small attacks everywhere at once, and human raiders would strike supply lines at all hours, and Elvari patrol ships would face harassment from human fighters that appeared without any warning and vanished just as quickly. The Elvari military machine was simply not designed for this type of warfare at all, and Elvari soldiers desperately needed regular rest periods, and ships required extensive maintenance, and crews needed substantial time to recover between major battles, and the humans gave them absolutely none of these necessary things, and human forces operated in carefully managed rotating shifts. And when Elvari crews finally managed to get a brief chance to sleep, human ships would arrive and force them back into immediate action, and it was mentally and physically exhausting, and completely demoralizing. Reports began flooding into the command center, where Valandra reviewed them with growing alarm, and 3 client races that had been loyal parts of her empire for many centuries suddenly declared their independence, and they cited the endless war as clear proof that Valandra could no longer protect them adequately, and major trade routes collapsed as merchants refused to travel through active war zones, and the Elvari economy began to suffer serious damage. Even worse than the military situation, protests erupted on the Elvari homeworld itself, and Elvari citizens who had lived peaceful, comfortable lives for many generations now watched their sons and daughters returning home broken and traumatized from a war that never seemed to end, and the protesters gathered in huge crowds and chanted mockingly about 10 times in one night, and the phrase that had started as Valandra expressing confused question had become a powerful symbol of her complete failure to understand the enemy. Valandra sent more ships and more soldiers, but absolutely nothing changed at all. And for every human position that Elvari forces managed to capture, 2 more human positions would appear somewhere else, and the humans had adapted their entire society for total war, and factories ran constantly producing new weapons, and ships and training centers operated around the clock, preparing fresh new soldiers and even human civilians, far from the fighting contributed by working extra shifts to support. Their military admiral, Kate Morrison, had been promoted to lead all human forces throughout the entire sector, and she implemented a new strategy that humans called the Exhaustion Protocol. And human forces would engage Elvari ships in combat and then retreat strategically before taking serious damage. And the Elvari would chase them thinking victory was finally close, but the humans would lead them directly into another carefully prepared ambush, and then another, and the Elvari ships would fight for many hours, trying desperately to catch an enemy that stayed just out of reach, and eventually the completely exhausted Elvari crews would have no choice but to withdraw, while fresh human forces took their place and the cycle would begin again. Valandra realized with growing dread that she had made a terrible mistake, and these humans were not the weak primitives she had assumed, and they were something far more dangerous, and they were a species that had learned to turn their own weakness into strength and their mortality into motivation. Ashenthar could no longer remain silent and watch this disaster unfold, and the ancient dragon decided he must take action, and so he flew alone to the front lines without telling Valandra his plans, and he demanded to speak directly with Admiral Kate Morrison, and the meeting was arranged to happen on a small neutral moon positioned between the 2 battle zones, and Kate arrived with only a small security team accompanying her, and the massive dragon landed and folded his enormous wings. Kate stood before the ancient creature without showing any fear at all, and she had been fighting constantly for many months, and had witnessed far too much death and suffering to be intimidated by anything anymore. And Ashenthar spoke directly into her mind, using his ancient powers, and he told her that Queen Valandra would never surrender under any circumstances, and the pride of the Elvari queen would not allow such a thing, and therefore the war would continue endlessly until one side was completely destroyed. Kate replied calmly that humans were fully prepared for a very long war, if that became necessary, and they had fought wars lasting for decades in their history, and they could certainly do it again if required. But she also knew that her people were suffering terribly, and every single day of continued war meant more death and destruction for both sides, and if there existed any possible way to end the conflict faster, she would seriously consider it. Ashenthar proposed something completely unexpected that caught Kate off guard, and he suggested formal single combat between chosen champions from each side, and this was an ancient Elvari tradition that had been used to settle major disputes for thousands of years, and if a human champion could successfully endure one full night of combat against Valandra herself, from sunset to sunrise, then the Elvari would withdraw all their forces, and if the human champion fell, then humanity would surrender their core worlds to Elvari control. Kate immediately understood this was extremely dangerous for humanity, and Valandra possessed 8 full centuries of combat experience and incredibly powerful magic, and she was arguably the greatest warrior in the entire Elvari Empire, but Kate also knew the human fleet was stretched dangerously thin across too many fronts, and they desperately needed time to rebuild and repair. And she made the difficult decision to accept the challenge on behalf of all humanity. When Valandra learned of the formal wager, she was genuinely pleased for the first time in months, and finally she could end this horrible war in a manner that suited her personal sense of honor and ancient tradition, and she immediately announced that she herself would serve as the Elvari champion, and she fully expected to face Admiral Kate Morrison directly, or perhaps some heavily enhanced super soldier. And when Kate chose Lieutenant Amy Brooks as the human champion, Valandra felt deeply insulted. Amy Brooks was completely ordinary by any Elvari standards, and she possessed no cybernetic enhancements whatsoever, and she had no genetic modifications of any kind, and she was simply a regular human who happened to be exceptionally good at long-distance running, and before joining the military, Amy had worked in harsh mining colonies where the standard shifts lasted 16 brutal hours, and she knew very well how to push through extreme pain and exhaustion. The formal combat arena was constructed on a neutral station that both sides agreed upon, and thousands of beings from across the galaxy watched through broadcast feeds, and sunset marked the official beginning of the duel. And Valandra entered the arena wearing ancient ornate armor and carrying a blade that glowed brightly with concentrated magic, and Amy entered wearing only basic standard combat gear and carrying regular weapons. The fight began immediately, and Valandra dominated completely from the very first moment, and her speed and skill were absolutely overwhelming, and within just minutes she had landed several devastating strikes that would have instantly killed most living beings, and Amy fell hard but managed to get back up, and Valandra struck again with even more force, and Amy went down much harder, but again she slowly rose to her feet. This brutal pattern continued relentlessly for hours, and Valandra kept delivering attacks that were precise and devastating, and Amy mounted defense that was crude but somehow effective enough to avoid immediately fatal blows, and more importantly, Amy never stayed down for long, and no matter how hard she was struck, she would always climb back to her feet and continue fighting. As midnight passed, Valandra began to realize something was terribly wrong with her plan, and her magic was depleting much faster than she had expected, and maintaining this extremely high level of combat for so many continuous hours was exhausting even for someone with her experience. And meanwhile, Amy seemed to be adapting to the situation, and her movements were becoming more efficient, and she was learning to avoid the very worst attacks and conserve her energy. The 10th hour of combat arrived, and Valandra found herself breathing hard, and she had not fought continuously for this long in many centuries, and her muscles ached terribly, and her magic reserves were nearly completely empty, and Amy was covered in blood and bruises, but she still stood upright and still appeared ready to continue, and still showed no signs of surrender. Valandra attacked with desperate fury and landed strike after strike, and Amy went down, and Valandra thought with relief that it was finally over. But then Amy moved, and slowly and painfully, she pushed herself up onto her knees, and then somehow to her feet and her eyes met Valandra directly, and there was absolutely no surrender in them at all, and only pure determination. Dawn began to break over the station, and the first rays of sunlight came streaming through the arena windows, and the formal duel was officially over, and Amy Brooks had successfully endured the entire night, and she had survived, and the human had won. Valandra stood completely frozen in utter disbelief, and around her the massive crowd was silent. And then slowly the humans began to cheer loudly, and not because their champion had defeated the enemy in combat, but because she had done exactly what humans always did throughout their history, and she had endured. The scream of rage from Valandra echoed through the entire station, and she could not accept what had happened. And how could one single person endure so much punishment? And she had struck Amy Brooks dozens of times with blows that would instantly kill any Elvari warrior. And yet the human kept rising, and 10 times, and 20 times, and 100 times. And the question that had haunted Valandra for months now openly mocked her. By the ancient laws of formal combat, Valandra was bound by honor to keep the agreement, and she ordered her fleets to withdraw from human space immediately, and the Elvari armada began its long retreat. But Valandra herself remained at the station, and she wanted answers, and she demanded a private meeting with Kate Morrison. They met in a secure private chamber on the neutral station, and no guards and no witnesses, and just the ancient Elvari queen and the human admiral, and Valandra was still seething with anger. But underneath the anger was something else entirely, and perhaps it was fear, or perhaps respect. Kate spoke first, and she told Valandra that she understood the frustration, and from the Elvari perspective, humans must seem like an impossible paradox, and they were weak individually, but terrifyingly strong collectively, and they died young. But their civilizations endured across countless generations, and they had no magic, but they had built wonders through sheer effort. Valandra responded with cold logic, and she pointed out that Kate would be dead in 1 century at most, and Valandra would still be alive, and still powerful, and still remembering this defeat, and in the long span of history, human victories would be forgotten, while the Elvari Empire continued. Forever, Kate smiled quietly at Valandra and explained that the Queen was thinking about everything completely wrong. And yes, Kate herself would die. But there would be billions more humans exactly like her, and every human child learned about persistence and endurance from their very birth, and they learned about their ancient ancestors who survived terrible ice ages and devastating plagues, and they learned about the generation ships that carried humans to the stars, despite decades of constant hardship, and every single human carried within them the legacy of survivors. Valandra could fight 1 human generation and perhaps win. But could she fight 10 generations and 20 and 100? And each generation would remember the previous one, and each would learn from past mistakes, and each would be just as stubborn and persistent as the one that came before. And the Elvari had much longer individual lifespans, but humans had something more powerful, and they had cultural endurance that passed from parent to child across thousands of years. This explanation shook Valandra far more deeply than any military defeat had, and she realized with growing horror that the war she had been fighting was not against Kate Morrison or Amy Brooks or any individual human at all, and she had been fighting against an entire species that was built from the ground up to never quit, and every human was a small piece of something vast and unstoppable. Ashenthar entered the private chamber without being invited, and the dragon had been listening from outside the entire time, and he told Valandra directly that he had tried repeatedly to warn her about this, and the humans were exactly what he had feared from the very beginning, and they were not conquerors seeking glory, and they were survivors who simply refused to die, and survivors were the most dangerous beings in any universe because they could not be broken by force alone. The dragon then said something that shocked both women completely, and he announced that he was unbonding from Valandra after 8 centuries of faithful service, and Ashenthar was choosing to leave, and he had served the Elvari Empire loyally, but he could not continue to serve a ruler who refused to see the truth. And the universe was changing rapidly, and the Elvari needed to change with it or be left behind. Valandra felt her entire world crumbling around her. And first came the military defeats, and then the loss of face from the formal duel. And now her oldest and most loyal companion was abandoning her, and she demanded to know where Ashenthar planned to go, and the dragon replied simply that he would go to human space, and he wanted to understand these enduring ones much better, and perhaps he could even help the two species find lasting peace instead of endless war. Kate watched this exchange with careful neutrality, and she had not expected to gain a dragon as an ally, but she was certainly not about to refuse such a gift, and she told Ashenthar he would be welcome among humans as long as he came in genuine peace. Valandra was left alone in the chamber, and for the first time in 3,000 years she felt truly defeated, and not because her armies had failed in battle, but because she had failed to understand the enemy, and she had thought humans were weak primitives, and instead they were something far more frightening, and they were the kind of species that could fall 1,000 times and rise 1,001. In the following weeks, Valandra withdrew not just her military forces, but her entire empire from that entire region of space, and she declared the human sectors completely off limits to all Elvari ships, and let the humans have their small corner of the galaxy, and the Elvari Empire was vast enough without them. But Valandra sent one final message to Kate Morrison, and it was brief and cold, and the Queen said she would remember this defeat, and she would remember for centuries while Kate grew old and died, and someday, perhaps in 100 years or 1,000, Valandra would return, and then they would see if future human generations were as stubborn as this one. Kate received the message and recorded her response in her personal log, and she wrote that Valandra was welcome to try again in the future, and humans would still be there, and they would still be enduring, and they would still be taking one more step forward, no matter what obstacles appeared, and that was simply what humans did. Amy Brooks received a medal for her historic victory, but she did not enjoy the fame at all, and she requested an immediate transfer to a colony ship heading for unexplored space, and she wanted to get back to the real work of building new settlements. And the war had been necessary, but it was over now, and time to focus on survival and growth. Again, Kate approved the transfer and promoted Amy to head of security for the new colony mission, and the ship was named Endurance in honor of the human quality that had won the war, and hundreds of colonists eagerly signed up for the mission, and they wanted to be part of building the future for humanity. On the day Endurance launched, Kate stood in the observation deck and watched it go, and she thought about Valandra threatening to return in the future, and Kate herself would be dead by then, and her children might be dead too, but her grandchildren or great-grandchildren would be alive, and they would carry the same human traits that had won this war. Ashenthar arrived at Earth 1 month later, and the dragon was massive and terrifying. But he came in genuine peace, and human leaders were very cautious at first, but eventually welcomed him, and Ashenthar told them many stories of ancient wars and lost civilizations, and he warned them that the universe was dangerous and humanity had made powerful enemies. But Ashenthar also said something that gave the humans real hope, and he told them that in his 10,000 years of life, he had seen every kind of species and warriors who conquered through strength, and scholars who ruled through knowledge, and traders who dominated through wealth. But he had never seen a species quite like humans, and they had no single advantage, but they had something better, and they had the ability to simply keep going when everyone else quit. The dragon made a prediction that would be remembered for generations, and he said that in 1,000 years, when the Elvari Empire had fallen to dust and other civilizations had risen and collapsed, humans would still be here, and not because they were stronger or smarter or more magical, but because they were built to endure, and endurance in the end was the ultimate power. Years passed, and the story of the Endurance War became legend throughout human space, and children learned about Amy Brooks, who stood against an Elvari queen for an entire night, and they learned about Kate Morrison, who led the human fleet through impossible odds, and they learned about the time humanity faced an ancient empire and won through sheer stubborn persistence. Some historians argued endlessly about the details, and some said the war could have been avoided with better diplomacy, and others said humans simply got lucky. But everyone agreed on one important thing, and the war had proven something crucial about humanity. And it had shown the entire galaxy that humans might be young and weak compared to ancient species. But they had one quality that made them dangerous. They never quit, and they endured. And in a universe full of powerful beings who ruled through magic and strength and technology, the ability to simply keep going was sometimes the most powerful ability of all. The colony ship Endurance traveled far into unexplored space, and Amy Brooks trained the next generation of colonists, and her lessons were simple and direct, and she told them, the universe did not care if you were strong or fast or magical, and it only cared if you could take one more step when everything told you to stop, and humans always took one more step. News of the war spread throughout the galaxy, and other species watched with great interest, and some were impressed and some were frightened, and all of them took note that humans were not to be underestimated, and the Elvari Empire became more isolated as other species worried about provoking similar conflicts. Ashenthar lived among humans and became a valuable advisor, and he shared his vast knowledge freely, and helped humanity understand the dangers that existed in the galaxy, and young humans would gather around the ancient dragon and listen to his stories, and they asked him why he chose to leave his queen after so many centuries. The dragon would tell them that he had seen the future and it belonged to those who endured, and the Elvari were powerful, but they had grown comfortable and soft, and humans were still young and hungry and willing to suffer for their goals, and that made all the difference. On the Elvari homeworld, Valandra sat on her throne and brooded, and the defeat haunted her every day, and she had lived for 3,000 years and won countless victories. But this one loss overshadowed everything, and her empire was weakened and her reputation damaged, and worst of all, she knew the humans were right. She would outlive Kate Morrison and Amy Brooks and everyone from that war. But more humans would come, and they would remember, and they would be just as stubborn, and in a century or two they might even be stronger and better prepared. And Valandra realized she had made an enemy that would never truly go away. Some of her advisors suggested trying to make peace permanently and establish trade with humanity, and Valandra refused, and her pride would not allow it. And instead she began preparing for a future conflict, and she told herself that next time would be different, and next time she would understand the enemy better. But deep in her heart, Valandra knew the truth, and you could not defeat a species built to endure, and you could not outlast beings who simply refused to lose, and the humans had taught her a lesson she would never forget. Human colonies spread across more systems, and everywhere they went, they carried the lessons of the Endurance War, and they built their settlements to last, and they trained their people to persevere, and they remembered always that their strength came not from power, but from persistence. Kate Morrison lived to see her grandchildren born, and she told them stories about the war and about Queen Valandra, and about the day humanity proved itself among the stars. And her grandchildren listened carefully, and they understood that they carried a legacy, and they were part of something larger than themselves. When Kate finally passed away at the age of 93, the entire human sphere mourned and millions attended her memorial service, and Ashenthar spoke at the ceremony, and the dragon said that Kate had been the perfect example of what made humans special, and she had been neither the strongest nor the smartest, but she had been the most determined. And that had been enough. Amy Brooks continued her work on the frontier, and she never sought fame or glory, and she simply did her job day after day, and she trained new colonists, and she helped build new settlements, and she lived quietly and died peacefully, surrounded by people she had taught and protected. The colony she helped establish was named Brooks Landing in her honor, and it became one of the most successful human settlements in that region, and people who lived there carried on her teachings, and they knew how to endure hardship and overcome obstacles. Decades after the war, a young human diplomat named Claire Hayes was sent to meet with Elvari representatives, and it was the first official contact since the war ended, and the meeting was tense at first, and the Elvari were proud and cautious, and Claire was nervous but determined. She carried a gift for the Elvari delegation, and it was a copy of Kate Morrison book translated into the Elvari language, and Claire explained that humans wanted peace, but they wanted the Elvari to understand them first, and the book would help with that. The Elvari diplomat read the book carefully over many days, and he was struck by the honesty in it, and Kate had written about the cost of war and the suffering on both sides, and she had praised Elvari's skill and courage while explaining why humans fought the way they did, and the diplomat brought the book back to Valandra. The queen read it alone in her chambers, and she felt many emotions and anger and sadness and something close to respect. And Kate had not written to mock or insult, and she had written to explain and to teach. And Valandra realized that even in victory, the humans had shown restraint. Valandra sent a private message to Claire Hayes, and it was brief and formal, and she acknowledged that perhaps someday peace might be possible, and not now, and not soon, but someday. And Claire reported this back to human leadership, and they understood, and they were patient, and they could wait. And patience was another form of endurance. More years passed, and the galaxy changed, and new conflicts arose between other species, and humans stayed out of most of them, and they focused on building and growing and surviving, and they remembered the lessons from the Endurance War. When other species asked humans for military help, humans were careful in their responses, and they would assist if the cause was just. But they never sought war, and they understood that their greatest strength was also a burden, and the ability to endure terrible things meant they often had to endure them. A century after the war, Valandra still ruled her empire, and Kate Morrison descendants lived throughout human space, and the queen sometimes wondered if she should try again and test the new generation of humans and see if they were as strong as their ancestors. But Ashenthar would visit her occasionally, and the dragon had not forgotten his former bond, and he would remind her that humans had only grown stronger and more numerous, and another war would end the same way or worse, and Valandra would nod and return to waiting. The humans built monuments to those who fought in the Endurance War, and the largest was on Earth itself, and it showed Amy Brooks standing battered but unbowed, and underneath was a simple inscription, and it said only this, "And we endure." Young humans would visit the monument and touch the stone and make silent promises, and they promised to remember, and they promised to carry on the legacy, and they promised to never give up no matter what came. And in the stars, above, human ships continued their eternal patrol, and colony ships pushed ever outward into unexplored space, and research stations studied the mysteries of the universe, and everywhere humans went, they brought with them that one unshakable quality. They endured, and they persisted, and they survived. And they took one more step, and then another, and they never stopped moving forward, and in a universe vast and dangerous, and full of beings far more powerful than themselves, humans had found their place. They were not the strongest, and they were not the smartest, and they were not the most magical, but they were the ones who would still be there when everyone else had given up. And that was enough. and that would always be enough. The story of the Endurance War passed into history, and then into legend and children across human space. Grew up hearing about the day their species proved itself, and they learned that power came in many forms, and sometimes the greatest power was simply refusing to quit. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Elvari Empire watched and waited and remembered, and Queen Valandra sat on her throne and thought about the humans, and about endurance, and about the terrible lesson she had learned. You could not break what refused to bend, and you could not outlast what was built to endure, and humans were survivors, and survivors were the most dangerous beings in the universe because they would always be there, waiting ready to take one more step forward no matter what. Kate Morrison retired from active duty 5 years after the war ended, and she settled on a quiet colony world and wrote a book about her experiences, and the book became required reading in human military academies. And in it, she wrote about the moment she realized humans would win the war, and it was not during any particular battle. It was when she saw Elvari soldiers giving up, while human soldiers kept fighting despite being outnumbered and outgunned, and that was when she knew, and you could not defeat an enemy that refused to accept defeat. The book ended with a simple message to future generations, and she wrote that humans would face many challenges among the stars, and there would be species stronger than them and smarter than them and more advanced in every way. But none of that mattered as long as humans remembered who they were, and they were the species that crossed oceans in wooden boats, and they were the species that survived extinction events and built civilizations in the harshest environments, and they were survivors. And as long as they remembered that they would endure anything the universe threw at them,